Welcome to the 4th Annual Women's History Symposium. The theme of this year's symposium is Arizona Women, Our History, Our Vote, Our Democracy. My name is Melanie Sturgeon, and I am the president of the Arizona Women's History Alliance. We organize these symposiums. Our symposiums are directed toward those who are interested in learning about the contributions of Arizona women from all walks of life. Women who represent our rich and diversified cultural, social, economic, and political history. Learning about the efforts, the struggles, the victories, and defeats of our predecessors, exploring the issues they fought for, and understanding the ways in which those efforts have influenced the present are legacies that can touch both the intellect and the heart of those who participate in the symposium. Reflecting thoughtfully on the experiences of women from a variety of backgrounds, races, and cultures, especially those experiences that are different from our own, and appreciating the things those women did, even if we do not agree with them, is fundamental to helping build a just and civil society. Marcel Proust, an early 20th century French novelist and essayist, wrote, quote, "The real voyage of discovery consists not in seeking new landscapes, but in having new eyes," close quote. History gives us the opportunity to explore past events, to ask new questions, to discover, to see familiar landscapes with new eyes, to feel a sense of connection to those who came before us and our contemporaries. It cultivates an understanding of and appreciation for the endless variety in the ways that people and societies live. The root word of history is the Greek word historia, meaning inquiry, a systematic investigation into a subject. The historical approach asks questions, seeks evidence, weighs this evidence, provides thoughtful and well-reasoned analysis and interpretation, weaves context into discovery, looks at change over time, and includes contrasting and often competing points of view and perspectives. Sometimes this analysis provokes contradiction or controversy, but it is critical that writers, readers, and participants in discussions of history be willing to listen to another's viewpoint. The end result of this approach seeks to explain the human experience and to describe the ways they shape our understanding of the world. We encourage audience participation. If you have a question or want to make a comment, please use the chat function in Zoom. If you have never used the chat function, click on chat at the bottom of your screen. It will open a box on the right side of your screen. Write your comment or question, then hit enter, and we will all be able to see what you have written. When the presenter is finished, she will read off your questions and respond. We ask that you please keep yourself muted and keep your video off as well. Excuse me. I am so pleased to be able to introduce Katie Hobbs, Arizona's Secretary of State, as our first speaker. Secretary Hobbs has led a life of service, beginning as a volunteer at her church and continuing with her job as a social worker and chief compliance officer at one of the largest domestic violence centers in the US. The focus of her life has been to help others to gain security, to be heard, and to create better lives. That fundamental motivation inspired her to run for Secretary of State after serving in the Arizona House of Representatives and the Arizona Senate as minority leader. She brings her years of experience to the office of the Secretary of State to ensure that it runs productively and that Arizona elections are secure, fair, and efficient. Secretary Hobbs has been a professional social worker since 1992. Prior to being elected to the legislature, she worked in the areas of domestic violence, behavioral health, and homelessness. Secretary Hobbs will be setting the framework of today's and tomorrow's discussions. Well, please welcome Secretary Katie Hobbs.
Hi, good morning, everyone. I am so happy to be here at this Women's History Symposium with all of you. In 2000, even though we didn't celebrate in person, we did indeed commemorate the 100th anniversary of the ratification of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The 19th Amendment reads, "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or any state on account of sex." The marking of the 100th anniversary also provided the perfect opportunity to discuss the difficult and sometimes messy struggle for women's right to vote, and to remember that the 19th Amendment provided some women with this right, but it would be years before women and other people of color were also able to exercise this fundamental right. This is especially important context now, as we are in a moment where voting rights are once again under attack in legislatures here in Arizona and across the country. As Secretary of State and Arizona's Chief Elections Officer, I'm in a unique position to see firsthand the value of each vote cast in an election. When I came into this office, my focus was on building relationships and expanding the franchise of voting. That investment in building partnerships paid off in spades, as evidenced by the record turnout in the 2020 elections, despite monumental challenges presented by the pandemic and a plague of mis and disinformation about the integrity of our election processes. In our current landscape, we can look to the efforts in 1948 in Seneca Falls, New York, to inform the choices we make in the fight to expand the franchise today. The Seneca Falls Convention was organized by Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Lucretia Mott and was the first women's rights convention in the United States. This was a monumental moment in the long fight for the social, civil, and religious rights of women. Elizabeth Cady Stanton began the convention with these words: "We are assembled to protest against a form of government existing without the consent of the governed, to declare our right to be free as man is free, to be represented in the government which we are taxed to support, to have such disgraceful laws as give a man the power to chastise and imprison his wife, to take the wages which she earns, the property which she inherits, and, in case of separation, the children of her love." The convention leaders introduced 11 resolutions on women's rights. Drafted by Stanton, this declaration of sentiments and grievances was modeled closely on the Declaration of Independence. Stanton added women to its preamble, proclaiming, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men and women are created equal." Resolution 9, the right of women to vote, was the most controversial, as it called on women to secure to themselves their sacred right to the elective franchise. But after much discussion and the fervent appeals of both Stanton and Frederick Douglass, a former slave, outspoken abolitionist, and proponent of women's suffrage, the resolution passed. Douglass wrote the following after attendance at the convention: "In respect to political rights, we hold woman to be justly entitled to all we claim for man. We go farther and express our conviction that all political rights, which it is expedient for man to exercise, it is equally so for women. All that distinguishes man as an intelligent and accountable being is equally true of woman. And if that government is only just, which governs by the free consent of the governed, there can be no reason in the world for denying to woman the exercise of the elective franchise, or a hand in making and administering the laws of the land. Our doctrine is that right is of no sex." In New York and across the United States, newspapers covered the convention both in support of and against its objectives. Horace Greeley, the editor of the New York Tribune, echoed the opinion of many people at the time. While skeptical of giving women the right to vote, he argued that if American men really believed in the Constitution, women must be given equal rights. He said, "When a sincere Republican is asked to say in sober earnest what adequate reason he can give for refusing the demand of women to an equality with men in political rights, he must answer None at all. However unwise and mistaken the demand, it is but the assertion of a natural right and must be conceded. In the years following, such well-known suffragists as Elizabeth Cady Stanton, Lucretia Mott, Susan B. Anthony, Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, Carrie Chapman Catt, Alice Paul, Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Ida B. Wells, and so many others campaigned for women's rights at local, state, and nationwide events. Before the Civil War, the women's suffrage movement was allied with the anti-slavery cause, a natural connection because here were the two largest groups being kept voiceless by the white men who were in positions of authority. After the war, when pressure was building for a constitutional amendment guaranteeing newly freed Black men the right to vote, leaders of the suffrage movement were optimistic this amendment could be inclusive enough to guarantee the same right to women. The congressional leaders who were framing the amendment felt that it was more urgent to have the amendment cover recently freed Black males, and so refused to include women in this amendment. This action split the members of the American Equal Rights Association. At their annual meeting, Frederick Douglass argued that Black men's right to vote should take precedence over women's right to vote, saying, "With us, the matter is a question of life and death." The white women in this movement refused to support the 15th Amendment. By the way, this tactic of dividing natural allies in social justice movements and creating a false choice, pitting communities against each other, is one that is still being used today. In July of 1968, the 14th Amendment was adopted. It defined who is a citizen of the United States. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the states wherein they reside. Women, therefore, were citizens unless they were part of a group excluded from this amendment. In March of 1870, the 15th Amendment became law. It prohibited exclusion from voting on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. In response to this amendment, many former Confederate states passed Jim Crow laws that disenfranchised Black and poor white men from voting through poll taxes, literacy tests, and other restrictions. And we are in a moment again where the freedom to vote is being threatened. In Congress and in state legislatures, including our own, a handful of politicians are using the lies about the 2020 election to build barriers to voting, barriers which can take years to dismantle, as we saw with Jim Crow laws. It was 8 years after the 15th Amendment became law that a women's suffrage amendment was proposed for the first time in the US Congress. Interestingly, when the 19th Amendment passed 41 years later, it was worded exactly the same as that 1878 amendment. The Western states led the way in passing legislation that gave women who live within the boundaries of those territories and states the right to vote. Wyoming was first in 1869. In 1893, Colorado adopted women's suffrage. In 1896, both Utah and Colorado included women's suffrage in their constitutions, followed by Washington in 1910 and California in 1911. And soon after that, in 1912, followed by Oregon, Kansas, and Arizona. In 1913, Alice Paul organized a suffrage parade that marched through the streets of Washington, D.C. on the eve of Woodrow Wilson's presidential inauguration. Thousands of women participated, and as many as 500,000 people watched. American suffragists such as Ida B. Wells and Mary Church Terrell were asked not to march with their states, but instead to march at the back of the parade. Wells, Terrell, and other African-American women ignored this and joined the parade with their states or organizations. As these women stepped into a new phase of the suffrage movement, they failed to leave racism behind. During this parade, the suffrage marchers were attacked and hundreds of women injured. The police stood by and made no arrests. In January of 1917, Alice Paul's National Women's Party organized the Silent Sentinel pickets outside the White House, the first time the White House was picketed by protesters. In May, police began arresting these silent sentinels, and over the next 2 years, more than 500 women were arrested and 168 of them incarcerated. Many of those jailed at Occoquan Workhouse in Virginia went on hunger strikes and were force-fed. In November of 1917, jailed silent sentinels were beaten, chained in stress positions, and rendered unconscious. They were released that same month after public outrage at their treatment. In Congress, it was the Southern Democrats who were the staunchest foes of the 19th Amendment. Even after President Woodrow Wilson, a Democrat, reversed his position in 1918, he was unable to persuade his own party to use its congressional majority to give women the vote. But finally, though, Congress did pass the 19th Amendment on June 4th, 1919, and sent it out to the states for ratification. Tennessee was the 36th state to ratify the amendment on August 18th, 1920, officially recognizing women's right to vote. After 72 years of organized struggle, the majority of American women finally achieved the same rights as men at the ballot box, a landmark victory that changed American women's lives forever. A quote by suffragists Carrie Chapman Catt and Nettie Rogers Schuler summarizes the length and struggle of the fight. It was a continuous, seemingly endless chain of activity. Young suffragists who helped forge the last links of that chain were not born when it began. Old suffragists who forged the first links were dead when it ended. The passage of the 19th Amendment, again, did not mean that every male and female of voting age could now vote. Anyone not considered a citizen by the federal government could not vote. And since states could enact their own laws about the qualifications for voting, many of them created literacy tests, poll taxes, and other obstacles. It took many years to claw back these barriers, and we are still seeing similar attempts making their way through the state legislatures now. On December 6, 1937, in Breedlove versus Suttles, the US Supreme Court ruled that poll taxes set by states were constitutional. Then in 1964, on January 23rd, the 24th Amendment to the US Constitution was ratified, and this amendment formally abolished poll taxes and literacy tests as barriers to voting. 1 year later, in August of 1965, President Rights Act into law. This act, among other things, prohibited racial discrimination in voting, and later amendments to the act have expanded its protections. These events remain relevant as portions of the Voting Rights Act are today being chipped away through legal and legislative actions. And many lawmakers are trying to rehash debunked theories about the security of the 2020 election as an excuse to limit access to voting. Just as a reminder, I'd like to highlight a few of the measures that are in place to ensure the fairness and security of elections in Arizona that really fly in the face of many of the bills that are being proposed to limit voting. Election equipment that's purchased for use in state or federal elections by counties in Arizona must first be certified by the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission before it's reviewed and recommended for certification by our Election Equipment Certification Advisory Committee. And this is a process which is publicly noticed and held pursuant to open meeting laws, meaning that the public can participate and provide public comment. All voting equipment used in federal and state elections in Arizona goes a logic and accuracy test by each county before each election, followed by logic and accuracy testing of randomly selected equipment by our office in each county. Additionally, the 2019 Elections Procedures Manual requires an additional post-election logic and accuracy test be conducted by the counties. All of these LNA tests are publicly announced and include representatives of each political party. Counties conduct a post-election hand count audit of randomly selected precincts immediately following the election, with participation of each political party. A mix of members of each political party is required to be working at every polling place in the state. This ensures that no polling place is staffed by all Republicans or all Democrats. Another way that we help to ensure fairness. Additionally, a credentialed poll observer of each political party is allowed in every single polling place. Members of each political party are also required to be involved in all ballot tabulation functions. Again, these are hired staff and they're required to be a mix of each party. Additionally, credentialed observers of each political party are also allowed in every tabulation room. There are also cameras in every tabulation center with live streams that can be accessed via the internet. Despite all of this legislative session, one Arizona lawmaker introduced a bill that would give the legislature the power to revoke the certification of presidential electors chosen by Arizona voters, thereby making a vote for president meaningless in Arizona unless the majority party in the legislature likes the winner. Others have proposed new restrictions on who can receive a ballot by mail or how and when the ballot has to be returned, as well as limitations on early voting. In a year following between 80 and 90% of voters using Arizona's early voting options. Now is not the time to make our democracy smaller. It is time to double down. Let's remove archaic barriers that disenfranchise Arizonans and look for new solutions to secure our elections and promote voter confidence. This is why my office promoted a legislative package that would streamline election administration, expand voting rights, and enhance election security. There are those who want us to believe that elections today must either be secure or accurate, and this is simply a false choice. Much like the false choices posed to the suffragists of the past, we can do both. We can have both access and security. The 2020 elections proved this, and my office will continue to fight every day to ensure this. I am so incredibly grateful to those voting rights advocates who paved the way for our work. Our dedication to expanding the franchise must not waver. The job is not done because there are still barriers to participation, and we know that our democracy works best when more people participate. Thank you so much for having me here today and for the important work that you all are continuing.
Thank you very much, Secretary Hobbs, for that presentation. We really appreciate that and really have set the framework for our discussion the next 2 days. So thank you. Our next speaker will be Allison Lang. And Allison is a historian who explores the stories that images tell about the intersection of gender and power in US history. Currently, she is an associate professor at the Wentworth Institute of Technology in Boston. In 2020, the University of Chicago Press published Lange's book, Picturing Political Power, Images in the Women's Suffrage Movement. The book focuses on the ways that women's voting rights activists and their opponents used images to define gender and power. For the 19th Amendment centennial, Lang served as historian for the United States Congress's Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. She also curated exhibitions at the Massachusetts Historical Society and Harvard's Schlesinger Library, as well as a website for Melinda Gates' pivotal ventures called Truth Be Told, Stories of Black Women's Fight for the Vote. Presently, she's creating the first series on American women's history for the Great Courses. Most recently, she won a fellowship from the Université Gustave Eiffel in Paris, France, to teach and research there in the fall.
Hello, everyone. Thank you all for joining me today. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Melanie, for organizing us. And I'm excited to speak with you all today about women's voting rights and particularly the visual culture of this really important movement. So today we're going to be talking about the history of women's voting rights in the United States, particularly the ways that women's rights activists, women's voting rights activists in particular, actually tried to change conversations about gender and politics through the use of images. So we often think about these activists giving speeches, writing books, writing pamphlets, distributing newspapers. But what I am really emphasizing today is that they were very aware of the ways, the stereotypes of women in politics, who are often represented as masculine women who are threatening society. And they were very aware of those stereotypes, and they worked to try to change those stereotypes. And one of the things that I'm hoping that will be really clear to you by the end of our conversation is that a lot of the debates about women's rights activists, women in politics, women in leadership positions, in some ways, these images are still part of our visual conversations that we have today, even if they're no longer, in illustrated newspapers and they're more on social media, perhaps. Some of these visual conventions, these visual themes are very much part of 21st century life. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. So I'm going to actually start us off thinking about current images. So images that we encounter fairly regularly today or in the past 6 months or a year that remind me of suffrage images, of politics and protests that were really created by the suffrage movement. So we're going to start in the 21st century, believe it or not. All right, so the first thing I'd like to show you is this photograph. This is from the 2017 Women's March in Washington, D.C. This is Pennsylvania Avenue. And you can see a lot of posters, you can see a lot of people. Perhaps some of you who are very familiar with what Susan B. Anthony looks like even recognize Susan B. Anthony here. Susan B. Anthony today is really one of the most famous suffragists. When you ask one of my students if they can name a suffragist, they're most likely to say Susan B. Anthony, and that may be the case for you too. And so this is, a representative of the 19th century women's rights movement that is still very famous today. We see her here with Eleanor Roosevelt, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and other really prominent women. And I want to really emphasize today during our conversation that Susan B. Anthony, this is not by chance that she's became one of the most famous suffragists. She worked very hard so that she would be remembered, so that people would imagine her, understand her to be the most important leader, perhaps, of the suffrage movement. She distributed her portrait in order to really emphasize that too. And so we'll talk about that a little bit. And the result of all her actions is that she has become this very important symbol of the suffrage movement as a whole, even in the 21st century. Going back a little bit earlier, this is from 1913, and this is also on Pennsylvania Avenue, but it's a very different parade. This is the first women's voting rights parade in Washington, D.C. in 1913, and this is Inez Milholland. And she may not be a very familiar name to you, but I guarantee you that in the early 20th century, she was a very familiar name to the public. She was one of the most famous suffragists. She was incredibly smart. She was one of the early women to actually attend law school. And she attended at New York University, which is one of the schools that first opened up to women. But she was also famous for being the most beautiful suffragist. So she was very much considered to be this kind of ideal representative of this new, young, highly educated, pretty brand of suffragist. And was very much, someone who appeared in a lot of newspapers on the front page, including this particular photograph. One of the things that happened in the past year really reminded me of this photograph in particular. This is Breonna Noble riding a horse in Oakland, California, as part of the Black Lives Matter protests. And I thought it was really interesting that this photograph became viral, that this photograph was distributed really widely around this time. And you can obviously see why it's compelling to me as a visual culture scholar that these photographs of women on horses who are riding them through urban areas, who are representing a particular political movement, there are obvious similarities here. And so I think it's interesting that these two images that are, over a century apart became so popular, and the one above became so popular that it actually became part of an advertising campaign by Xfinity. And so ultimately this shifts from being just simply an iconic political protest image, but also an advertising image, an image that is intended to sell a product as well. So that is another difference between the two. Another really interesting kind of connection between the past and the present is that the suffragists really made the space outside of the White House a very important space for political protest. So prior to the suffragists picketing the White House in 1917, no one had picketed the White House before. They were the very first ones to picket the White House. And probably if you went to Washington, D.C., visited the White House today or any time in the last 20 years or so, you've probably seen people protesting something, anything. And so that it really created this legacy of the White House being a very important place for protest. One of the most famous ones of the past year, of course, being this decision to paint Black Lives Matter on the street right outside the White House. So this is something that continues, obviously, to this day. Another kind of image related to the suffragists that you might have seen over the past several years is a lot of women in leadership positions wearing white. So this is from a State of the Union address, but there are plenty of other events where we've seen women in politics wearing white. They're wearing white, of course. You saw Inez Milholland from the 1913 parade wearing white. Suffragists wore white. One reason was because of its association with purity, with morality, with virtue. And that was one thing that suffragists wanted to emphasize about themselves. However, there was an even more practical reason for them to wear white. So as you know, in the early 20th century, photographs are black and white. And so if you have a bunch of women wearing bright white costumes against a gray, black street, gray toned backdrop, they're going to really show up in photographs better, right? So they're going to kind of be these bright white figures against these dark backdrops, and that's going to make them look better, look more put together, really stand out in newspaper photographs of the day. And even in the 21st century, when you see these women kind of in a congressional room, for example, they also still stand out even in our color photographs. So this white had a symbolic reason for people wearing it, but it also had a very practical one that was very much part of the visual strategies of the suffrage movement at the time. I don't think that many people realize that that's partially because of the black and white photographs of the early 20th century that that some of us are wearing white today to events like this. So I'm going to dive much further back, and I'm going to start getting us to the roots of these conversations, the roots of these decisions that the suffragists eventually made that I give you a little bit of a taste of. We're actually going to go back to the 18th century. This is from 1775. This is from the year before the Declaration of Independence, just on the precipice of the rebellion. This is by Philip Daw, who is actually a London artist. And he probably had never been to the colonies before. Probably what happened is he read a newspaper article about a group of women in Edenton, North Carolina, who had decided to sign a petition to boycott tea. And so this is the scene that he imagined, right? This is not a flattering scene. So when we're looking at this, we can see a lot of details that give us those clues. So there's a woman with a gavel. She has these, over-exaggerated features, this large nose. It's not flattering. It's not refined. It's not feminine and delicate features, according to, 18th century standards. We see a woman in the back holding a big punch bowl. And this is not a fruit punch, a non-alcoholic fruit punch. This is a alcoholic punch. And so we see one woman drinking it and another woman tipping the bowl back. So the suggestion is that women are ruling this scene with a gavel, and they're also drinking during this event. Another group of women is pouring out the tea in tea canisters, and all of these women are ignoring the child under the table. There's a child under the table playing. The only thing paying attention to the child under the table is a dog who is licking the child, right? So this is a scene that imagines exactly what things look like if women decide to participate in politics. And the assumption is that if they do so, they will ignore their domestic tasks, they will ignore their childcare duties, they will not be participating in traditional gender roles for women. The other detail I want to make sure you notice is that there's a Black woman behind the woman with a gavel. She has a quill and an inkwell on a tray. Probably she's supposed to represent an enslaved woman, right? This is 1775, North Carolina. She probably is intended to be an enslaved Black woman from that time period. When you look at the expression on her face, she also looks interested in participating, right? Like she looks this close to signing her own name to this petition. And so the artist is suggesting two things here. One, as we said, that this group of women is challenging the patriarchy, challenging the expected roles of men in society, right? The other thing that this image is doing is suggesting that if women are able to challenge these expectations, then perhaps Black women or Black Americans, enslaved Black people as a whole will also challenge white supremacy, will challenge the institution of slavery, which is the underpinnings of the entire British economy at this time. So the suggestion is that there's this slippery slope. If we let women participate in politics, then not only will white women want to do it, but also Black women. So we have this kind of big shift. We're jumping forward to 1851, so about 75 years later. And yet what I want you to notice is that the themes here, a lot of the visual conventions are actually shockingly similar. So one of the things that's changed for women's rights activism during this time is that there are finally, we've got the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848. We've got the first women's rights national conventions happening in Worcester, Massachusetts. I'm based in Boston, so I'm very close to Worcester, Massachusetts at the moment. They start in 1850. Second one's in 1851. So by 1851, when this print is published, everyone's kind of aware that the women's rights movement is growing. They have a sense of what they want as well. And so this image imagines a scene of what Mrs. Turkey, who's a leader of this women's rights movement, looks like and what she believes in. So she's smoking. She also has on bloomers, which are a kind of a form of pant, an early form of women's pants, which were seen as quite controversial, quite scandalous. And you can even see her ankle, which may not seem like a big deal to us in the 21st century, but I guarantee you in the 19th century when we're not showing their ankles. So this would have been seen as scandalous. She has her hand placed, I would say, quite condescendingly on the head of a man who might be her husband, who's just like hunched over. He looks like an old woman who's doing menial tasks like mending clothes, right? She's also, both of them are ignoring the child in the front, right? The child is crying. The child is carrying a banner that says, "No more Papa and Mama." And so this is a suggestion that this woman has abandoned her domestic tasks. She's now forcing her husband to take on women's roles. In the background, we have two other women. One, I think, is intended to represent a domestic servant. She's wearing or holding a banner that says "No more basement and kitchen," right? So she's protesting this class hierarchy, that she shouldn't have to be working in the basement and kitchen all the time, right? Another is a Black woman who is also smoking, like her main figure. And she's holding a banner that protests slavery. So we have here another representation of this idea that if women win rights, then the social hierarchy as a whole, whether it's based on class, whether it's based on race, etc., all of these things will be challenged. And this is a quite popular kind of image by the 1850s. Illustrated newspapers become incredibly popular. Their technology makes them very cheap and easy to reproduce widely by the 1850s. And so this kind of image is an image that people would have encountered regularly, kind of like a modern 21st century meme. And so this is from 1851 as well. We see women smoking, we see women wearing bloomers. And to emphasize to you, women were not ever wearing bloomers that were this short, that had skirts that were this short. They were often, the skirts with bloomers actually went down to one's ankles as were just as long as regular dresses. We see women wearing men's clothing like top hats. We see another woman pulling up her bloomer pant to show off her ankle again. We also, one additional component of this piece is we see two women with their backs to us and they're linking arms. And this kind of gives us a suggestion that these women are not only kind of taking over the roles of men in a political sense, but also more interested in having relationships with other women than they are having relationships with other men, right? So it's suggesting that these women's rights activists are lesbians even, right? So these kinds of images were incredibly common. And by 1869, this is yet another image. We're about 100 years after that first historical image that I showed you. And we see this gathering of women by Currier and Ives. If you've ever heard the song Sleigh Ride, that Christmas song Sleigh Ride, you maybe have heard of Currier and Ives, a very famous printmaker in the 19th century. And we see this scene of women gathering to cast a ballot. And they're wearing outlandish fashions, right? Just like the bloomers from decades earlier. They're smoking, they're showing off their legs, their ankles. I love the banner in the center, which says, "Vote for the celebrated man tamer, Susan Sharptongue." So very particular ideas about who women in politics are, for sure. And one of my other favorite details is this woman who is holding her fist at a man who is presumably her husband, who is carrying a baby, right? And he looks absolutely terrified, appalled, shocked that his wife is telling him to take care of the baby so that she can go vote. And this is a very kind of popular trope, a very popular detail in these anti-women's rights cartoons. So these were incredibly popular images, and you can imagine why women's rights activists of the time period finally said to themselves, what can we do to change these stereotypes? And they didn't have any control over major print companies like Currier and Ives or illustrated newspapers like Harper's Weekly or any of the other kind of companies that we've looked at so far, but they could finally start distributing their own portraits of themselves, because there was a new type of photography technology, the wet plate process, that made it really cheap and very easy to reproduce these tiny carte de visites. They're very, very small. They're like baseball card size, and distribute them to the public. So the first photograph on the left is of Sojourner Truth. And Sojourner Truth was born in the 1790s in New York. She was born enslaved, and she was enslaved until she was in her 30s. And then she became one of the most famous anti-slavery and women's rights activists of that era, and partially thanks to her photograph that we see here. She started taking her photographs in the 1860s. She took a lot of different versions, but all of them really look very similar to this one. So she had a very particular idea of how she wanted to represent herself to her public and to later generations, to us. And when we look at this photograph, we kind of can get a sense of what she wants to tell us. One important detail is I think that she wants to emphasize that she is, a fairly traditional woman, right? There's a kind of domestic sense to this setting. We see flowers, we see knitting, we see this tablecloth and a book, kind of suggests that she's in a parlor, right? Her clothes are very kind of respectable, very modest, I would say, very simple. She's certainly not wearing bloomers. She's not showing off her ankles at all, right? She's got this shawl on, she's got a head wrap on, really kind of emphasizing her respectability, her refinement here. And so she, at the very bottom, her famous quote is, "I sell the shadow to support the substance." A shadow was a very popular term for a photograph in the 19th century, because people were literally making them using sunlight, right? So they're making them using sunlight, and so they're calling them shadows, and she is selling them herself to support the substance, which is her ideas, but also literally herself. She is a reformer as a profession, right? So she's giving these lectures, she's writing her biography, she's selling these photographs in order to raise money to support herself and her family. So these photographs aim to challenge those stereotypes about women's rights activists, as well as challenge racist stereotypes about Black people in American society in the 19th century. And on the other side, we have kind of a similar yet very different version of the leaders of the women's rights movement. We've got Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton is the one with the white curly hair. At the time, people often suggested that she looked like Martha Washington because of her hair. And these two women are not nearly looking as domestic as Sojourner Truth, right? They are pictured together. They're reading a book, but not in this kind of like parlor-like setting. They look like they're about to read that book and maybe even throw it at you. They look like they are ready to be assertive, ready to be aggressive in order to defend their ideals. They're also wearing much fancier clothing. They were much wealthier than Sojourner Truth. They've got lace and jewelry, and they are far more interested in representing themselves as the leaders of the women's rights movement than they are about kind of winning over respectability, winning over kind of claiming this sense of refinement that Sojourner Truth needs to as a Black woman. But lest you think that these photographs kind of changed everything and made everyone believe them that they were not these kind of masculine monsters, a lot of engravers actually just changed tactics. So instead of emphasizing that these women's rights activists were kind of just these generic women and not, you know, mocking anyone in particular, they started mocking particular women's suffragists because people started knowing what they looked like, right? So this 1873 cartoon is clearly directly copying this 1870 photograph. And so we have Aunt Susan B. Anthony standing with her hand on her hip here. Her skirt is far too short. She's got boots on, and if you look really closely, you can see spurs on those boots. In the background, we have a political protest of women. I guarantee you that in the 1870s, there were no like political rallies of women suffragists at the time. So this is like a very imagined scene. We've got a female police officer, and we've also got two men on the side here. One is carrying groceries, so doing a domestic task, and the other is carrying a baby, right? So we've got swapped gender roles again, this comical scene that very much reminds us of what we've been looking at already. And the update is that we can immediately recognize that Susan B. Anthony is the particular target here. One of the things that really makes this particular one stand out to me is that Susan B. Anthony often was photographed in profile. So she was often photographed in profile because she was really self-conscious about an eye issue that she had. And you can see that this is represented here. So you can see that one of her eyes, it looks a little off, and that the artist actually went so far as to kind of recreate that in this particular cartoon. If you think about the kinds of images that suffragists really wanted to look like, we can see that they wanted to emphasize that they were these political figures like presidents, that they were as respectable, as much political leaders like the ones we see here. And one of the major projects that they kind of take on in the 1870s and 80s is the history of women's suffrage, which is this major series that was first published in 1881. And it was published ultimately over the course of 6 volumes through 1922. Each of these volumes is about 1,000 pages each, and each one has a series of portraits in them. The very first volume was published by Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, the two women we see here, but also Matilda Jocelyn Gage, who is more often forgotten than these two. And so these two suffragists were actually aiming to emphasize their story of the suffrage movement. So obviously they included their own portraits of themselves as kind of featured images in the series. They also really emphasized the importance of their organizations and their newspapers and their importance in the movement's founding, right? So this is one of the reasons why Seneca Falls becomes so important, because Elizabeth Cady Stanton attended and she wrote the Declaration of Sentiments. And so they're the ones that turned Seneca Falls into the founding of the women's voting rights movement in 1848. So their story is really compelling. It has a lot of useful information and tells us a lot about the rise of women's rights activism in the United States. And yet it's only part of the story. So one of the major groups that they exclude in their story is men. As you can imagine, men were very important collaborators in the women's voting rights movement. They held political office. They were the ones who were voting. They edited women's rights newspapers. They wrote women's rights articles. They gave women's rights speeches. And yet, if you just look at this book, you probably wouldn't know that because they included no portraits of male suffragists. They also did not include any portraits of women of color. They could have included a portrait of Sojourner Truth, Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, or any number of women from the time period, but they chose not to. They really emphasized that white women were the leaders of this movement. And they also decided that the other suffrage organizations, including Lucy Stone's organization, the American Women's Suffrage Association, which was far larger than theirs, had a far more successful main newspaper than theirs was. They really neglected their organization entirely, almost entirely. So this is something that really shaped the story that we still tell today, because probably you are very familiar with Susan B. Anthony and much less familiar with Lucy Stone. So just to remind us, these anti-suffrage cartoons are continuing. They are changing format perhaps here. This is a stereograph. And yet the themes are remarkably similar. So we have this woman reading a newspaper, wearing bloomers, about to maybe ride her bike, while her husband is in the background and doing laundry. So suffragists decided to change tactics again. So they had tried emphasizing that they were their portraits and kind of showing that they were these respectable female leaders, just like male political leaders. But by the turn of the century, they really decided to start emphasizing that women were good mothers and caregivers, and that's why they should be good voters, right? So when we look at an image like this, we can see how it directly challenges, how it is in direct conversation with the anti-women's rights cartoons that we've been seeing that were popular since the 18th century. So this is an illustration by Blanche Ames. It's called Double the Power of the Home, Two Good Votes Are Better Than One, from 1915. And we see that there's a woman who is surrounded by three children. You know, she's holding them close, she's reading to them. They're in this idyllic home. It says, God bless our home on the back wall. There's like a tea kettle steaming away in the background. And this is what the suffragists, or what many suffragists, imagine as a good voter. So she's white, she's wealthy enough that she's not having to work during the day. So most likely her husband is off at work and she is at home taking care of children. And so this is the kind of person that the suffragists have in mind. The other detail I want to make sure we notice here is that we finally got a female artist, Blanche Ames. One of the shifts that we see around the turn of the century is that there are more women who are admitted to art schools and more women who are becoming professional artists. And they are the ones, there are some of the ones at least, who are creating this change in women's rights imagery. They're helping creating this campaign, not only as propaganda for the suffrage movement, but in the mainstream press as well. And so this is by Rose O'Neill. And you might be reminded of the design of the Cupid doll, which is a doll that style that she invented herself. And we can see the similarities between these two images, the themes that are similar. It says, give mother the vote, we need it. because politics rules their food, their health, their play, their homes, their schools, their work. And the idea is that women need the vote in order to be better mothers, right? In order to be better caregivers. They're not emphasizing here that women need the vote because they are equals in American society, because they should be able to hold political office. They're really emphasizing that it's because they are mothers. And so the stereotypes about suffragists do start to change by the 1910s. So this is an image from 1911, kind of showing the old stereotype of suffragists wearing these frumpy clothes, frumpy shoes, frumpy hat, into the new version, the new stereotype of a suffragist wearing fashionable clothes, a fashionable hat, fashionable shoes. And you can see that she's very similar to the other type of woman that's popular at this time from 1899, called the Gibson girl. But there are suffragists, there are plenty of women who do not fit this kind of type of what a good suffragist is supposedly supposed to be and look like. One of them is Mary Church Terrell. And Mary Church Terrell actually was born in 1863, and she was born enslaved. As you know, very soon after her birth, or as you can guess, very soon after her birth, she was a free woman. And she went on to become one of the first Black women in the United States to earn a bachelor's degree and a master's degree. She became a teacher in Washington, D.C., and she eventually became the first president of the National Association of Colored Women, which was an organization that was founded in 1896. And you might kind of wonder, well, why was there an organization specifically to fight for the vote for Black women? And one of the reasons is because a lot of the organizations led by white women did not allow Black women to be members at the local level. Some of them didn't allow them to become leaders either. They also were really limited on the scope of their platforms. So while Black women like Terrell decided that their new organization, the National Association of Colored Women, should think about Black women's voting rights, but they also needed to think about Black men's voting rights, because as you know, by 1890, things like poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses were preventing more and more Black men from actually exercising their right to vote. This organization is also thinking about improving education for local Black communities. They're also thinking about daycare for children. They're also advocating against lynching. So this organization is certainly focusing on women's voting rights, but also focusing on a much broader range of issues that are affecting the Black community. And one of the things to note here is that Mary Church Terrell is very interested in her public image. As you can see in this photograph, she's wearing a very elegant dress, lots of lace, has her hair done up very nicely. And she is she really values creating this image of this very respectable, very refined, very elegant, fashionable woman. And so we see her here on the left. This is an image from one of her promotional materials. And we see her, an image on the right of kind of an idealized version of what a new, quote, Negro woman looks like from the time period too. And you can see that they're very similar styles in hair and dress and kind of what this idealized Black woman is supposed to look like versus Terrell herself. And while all the images I've shown you so far have been common, pretty accessible to the general public, this is a really unusual one. This one's really different. And this is by John Henry Adams, and it's called The South's Battalion of Death. And so suffragists, propaganda printed by white suffrage organizations never really represented Black women. And so this is very different. It was printed by the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, and it emphasizes that Black women, Black mothers in particular, need the right to vote to protect their families. So we've got a woman with a bat labeled the Federal Constitution who is beating down segregation, Jim Crow laws, grandfather clauses, in order to protect her two children who are hiding in her skirts, right? So it's very similar to the ideas that we've seen in other suffrage propaganda where emphasizing that women as mothers need to vote. But the main difference here is that it's a Black woman. We also have a shift towards a new kind of protest politics in the suffrage movement in this time period. We discussed earlier this 1913 parade in Washington, D.C., and this is a photograph of the entire scene. It's pretty spectacular. It was arranged for the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration. And here's another kind of celebratory, colorful image of the parade. And the next image that I'm going to show you is going to give us a sense of why someone like Mary Church Terrell was trying to work so hard to challenge these racist stereotypes of Black women. And that's this political cartoon here. And this is about the 1913 parade. And it's doing two things. It's mocking the white suffragists who were opposed to having Black women like Mary Church Terrell march in the parade. And it's also critiquing and mocking Black suffragists. So we see them here represented with oversized, exaggerated features, not wearing nice clothing, not having good posture. So this is the kind of stereotype, this is the kind of racist stereotype, anti-women's rights imagery that Mary Church Terrell was thinking about when she was sitting for photographs like the ones that we were just looking at. And so she wants to emphasize that that women should, that Black women are these refined, respectable figures. And one of the other things that cartoon really reminds us is that there were really deep divisions among white suffragists and suffragists of color during this time period. And this is ultimately, in that particular parade, Mary Church Terrell did march. She organized a group of Delta Sigma Theta members from the local university, Howard University, which is a historically Black college. And she also, Ida B. Wells Barnett marched as well. So it ultimately became an integrated parade with women of color marching throughout. But as that cartoon shows, that was a real battle. There's a lot of tension around it too. And so in 1917, these political protests that we're just thinking about here become really even more controversial, more complicated, because suffragists decide to launch the first ever picket of the White House, which we discussed earlier. And this makes them look very radical. And so we've got these two different visual understandings of the suffrage movement. One is that they're emphasizing that women are caregivers, good mothers, and that's why they need the right to vote. The other is emphasizing that they are political equals, that they're taking over this protest space, such as this space outside of the White House to picket. As you probably already know, a lot of these suffragists who are picketing were arrested. They were sent to a workhouse. They were protesting their treatment there. So they actually went on hunger strikes and were ultimately force-fed. And so this kept the issue of suffrage in the news, not only in Washington, D.C., but nationally. And it started to make DC politicians, including President Woodrow Wilson, look really bad for his handling of these political protesters. At the same time in 1917, as you probably know, the United States was entering World War I. So this is a propaganda poster from World War I that very much recalls the suffrage imagery that we were looking at just a few minutes ago. It says, "The greatest mother in the world." And it's emphasizing that these women are enlisting in the war in order to care for soldiers. So not just caring for their families, but also caring for these patriotic men who are willing to give their lives for the war effort. And these women who are also, these nurses are also risking their lives as they go to battlefields to protect them. And so this poster kind of reminds us that this is the narrative that this becomes the most popular, becomes the most appealing. Ultimately, when Woodrow Wilson decides to address Congress in 1918 about why the United States should pass the 19th Amendment, he tells them that women deserve the right to vote because they were so patriotic during the war, because they proved themselves as caregiving citizens in order to support the war effort. So this is ultimately the kind of argument, the kind of rhetoric that appeals to politicians like Woodrow Wilson and many, many others, that kind of brings a lot of more moderate and conservative Americans over to support women's voting rights. However, I do want to emphasize that although Woodrow Wilson never said, "Oh, it was those picketers that convinced me," to support this cause. Although he never said that, I would argue that it's pretty hard not to believe that these women standing outside his front door that he could probably see from many rooms of his house did not have an effect on him, right? They probably were really influential and maybe even just bothersome to him because they put a lot of pressure on him because that issue was in the news so much. There was a lot of pressure on him to do something to change the way that he and his administration was perceived. So if you're interested in finding out a little bit more about these images, I have a book that you're welcome to check out. Otherwise, I'm delighted to answer questions and see what you all think.
One of the questions I have for you, Allison, is could you talk a little bit about the National Organization Against Women's Suffrage, that was created in 1911, and the kinds of things that images that they sent out?
Sure, yeah. So one of the kind of things that I think surprises people the most when I talk about, opponents to women's rights is how many of them were women, right? We often think about this movement as being just men versus women. Women were the women's rights activists, men were the opponents. That's absolutely not true, as you know. This is a movement that has men and women on both sides of the debate. The first anti-suffrage organization is actually formed in Massachusetts in 1895. And that's partially because the pro-suffrage movement is so strong in Massachusetts, right? So it makes sense that it becomes the place where anti-suffragists first organize. And it's not until 1911 where we have this early, this first national anti-women suffragette organization. And as we know, the first national suffrage organizations were founded in 1869, 1870. And so it is decades after suffragists started organizing. And so by that time, the anti-suffragists are quite behind. They don't have the kind of bureaucracy, the kind of fundraising, the kind of grassroots organizing from the national level to the state level to the local level that the suffragists have. They simply aren't as coordinated. However, they do have some anti-suffrage imagery, and their imagery really tends to emphasize that that anti-suffragists in particular are feminine, are more feminine, better mothers than the suffragists are, right? So in some ways, their imagery kind of resembles suffrage imagery at the time in a way. They're both kind of arguing that they are the more feminine, that they are the more motherly group. And one of the other things that really stands out to me from this conversation between suffragists and anti-suffragists of the time period is that we see anti-suffragists kind of critiquing suffragists who are going to meetings and leaving their children at home, right? So we see this critique of suffragists who are not paying attention to the home as much. And then we see on the suffragist side, suffragists making fun of anti-suffragists who are telling women not to leave the home while the anti-suffragists run their own meetings and run their own organizations and print their own newspapers, right? So we see some interesting conversations about, who's more feminine? Who's a better mother? And so that's, I think, one of the major tensions between those two.
Good. I see that there is a few questions for you here. Catherine May's asking, have you been able to contrast and compare your findings with other countries? The influences, perhaps, not just England, but Europe, Asia, Africa, Latin America?
That's a great question. And you're right to note, this questioner is correct to note that suffragists was not something that just took place. This movement was not something that just took place in the United States. This is a global movement. There was an International Women's Suffrage Association. And in fact, the head of the kind of white women-led organization in the United States was the founder of that international association. And they met with women all over the world. So it's really important to think about this as the global movement, as Catherine May does. I have tended to find the most connection, the most overlap. This questioner says not just England, but that is where I find the most kind of visual connections as far as especially with regard to political protests and spectacles from the time periods when we're thinking about the rise of this parade imagery, the rise of this political protest like picketing imagery. That is something that American suffragists are directly looking to British suffragists as they kind of coordinate that campaign. I think that I would be curious to find out about more connections between American suffragists and the rest of the world. I think that one of the other places to look in the future for that is actually in the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which you all might be familiar with, is an anti-alcohol, pro-prohibition group that was actually the first and the largest pro-women's suffrage organization for much of the 19th century. And they had an incredibly large global reach as well. And that might be a really interesting place to kind of delve further into the connections between American imagery and global imagery about women's rights activism.
Thank you. We have a question from Katie Solon. Thank you for sharing all the images, especially interesting to see those that were not familiar. To what did the suffragists turn their attention and energy after 1920?
That's a fantastic question. And it really depends on the suffragist. And of course, I'm sure that you can guess that. So some of them, including the National Women's Party, and the National Women's Party is the group that started picketing the White House in 1913. They turned their attention to the Equal Rights Amendment, as you may know, as part of the ERA task force. This is first proposed in 1923, and as you know, is still being debated, still being discussed, even in 2021. So that's one group of suffragists. Another group actually turned the National American Women's Suffrage Association into the League of Women Voters. And they became very concerned about educating women in particular about how to vote, what the issues are, how to find out more about candidates. And that is still one of the main goals of this organization today. So that's really, really central too. The other, there are a lot of suffragists who actually continued fighting for the right to vote even after the 19th Amendment passed in 1920. So as we know, the 19th Amendment actually states that you can't discriminate against voters based on their sex. It does not say women are granted the right to vote. It does not say women are guaranteed the right to vote. So in reality, there were plenty of women who did not have the right to vote after the 19th Amendment passed in 1920, right? Mary Church Terrell actually couldn't vote after the passage of the 19th Amendment. She, partially because DC voters couldn't vote, and she was a DC resident. There are plenty of women who were discriminated against, forced to, required to pay a poll tax they couldn't pay, whether they were Black or, simply poor. They were forced to try to take literacy tests. There was a lot of violence that was either threatened or carried out against people who wanted to vote as well. A lot of American women who had maybe lived in the United States for their entire lives could not become citizens yet. So, for example, Native American women didn't gain access to the ballot until 1924 with the Citizenship Act. And Asian American women didn't really gain citizenship in the United States until the 1940s. So, we know the Voting Rights Act of 1965 was incredibly important toward clearing the way towards greater access to the ballot as well. And so the thing I think to note is that these suffragists, many continue to fight for the vote after 1920. And in fact, as we learned just a few minutes before my presentation, this conversation about who can vote is still very much part of our current debates, right? We're still thinking about who can vote, whose vote should matter, and why that should be the case.
Thank you. Mary Rothschild has a question as well. Lucy Stone and Antoinette Brown Blackwell published The Women's Journal. Did the images in their journal take on a different political stance than Susan B. Anthony's History of Suffrage?
I'm so glad we have a women's journal question. The Women's Journal, as this question asker certainly knows, was far more successful, lasted decades longer than Elizabeth Cady Stanton and Susan B. Anthony's journal. They were actually, the Women's Journal had a slightly different political stance when they were a separate organization from Anthony and Stanton's. They were really focused on winning the vote at the state level rather than the federal level. So they were really focused on state by state campaigns. They were also very interested, very much more interested in kind of recruiting men to their organization. So they were a little bit more interested in being more moderate in a way than Anthony and Stanton were. When we're thinking about the images that were published there, unfortunately, I think one of the reasons why we don't remember Lucy Stone, Henry Brown Blackwell, I think that one of the reasons why we don't remember them as well is because they did not publish as many portraits and images of themselves, right? So Anthony and Stanton and Sojourner Truth, they were amazing self-promoters. But unfortunately, it's not until Lucy Stone's death that her daughter finally starts trying to, print her mother's portrait and emphasize that her mother was this really vital leader of the movement. But that just never catches on in the way that thinking about Anthony as a leader of the movement does. And so, if I were to go back in time and give Lucy Stone some advice as she's publishing the Women's Journal, I would say something like, publish some portraits of yourself so that people remember you. Because unfortunately, she is kind of, I would say, one of the suffragists who did the most, who, one of the many who we've lost track of, who hasn't kind of remained part of our popular culture.
Thank you. So I was just typing a question, but I'll just ask you now. How did the Women's Journal help or uplift those who were really fighting for suffrage? What kinds of articles did they write?
Yeah, the Women's Journal was incredibly important for organizing the movement from 1870. It's founded in 1870. It lasted well past actually the passage of the 19th Amendment in 1920, so over 50 years. And they did a lot of things that, we probably can't imagine organizing a movement, much less a conference or anything else, without email and phone calls and social media in the 21st century. But this was their way of doing it. So they basically helped organize events. They reported on local events. They reported on kind of state events or national conferences or meetings. And they reported, they kind of gave updates. So if a woman got elected to maybe a school board, they kind of report that bit of news. They give reviews of books. They discuss their stances on particular issues. This was the place that you could go to figure out how to respond to someone if they ask you a question about why women should have the right to vote, right? So this is where you would find out who the leaders of the movement are, what the ideas of the movement are, and kind of feel connected to all of the women across the United States and men who are advocating for this idea.
So how much support did they get from men?
That's a great question. And the answer is, quite frankly, significant support. When we think about Lucy Stone and the Women's Journal, it's important to note that Henry Brown Blackwell, her husband, took it over when she died. So he was quite dedicated to the Journal. And in fact, they're kind of famous for when they got married, protesting traditional marriage vows because they didn't believe that women should be subordinate to men. So this is a moment when someone like Henry Brown Blackwell is incredibly important. One of the first kind of presidents, former president, unfortunately, to endorse suffrage is Theodore Roosevelt. Unfortunately, it's after he's president, but it's still a really important moment in the early 20th century when we start to see a shift in very popular figures, men, influential figures kind of endorsing, lending their support to this cause. So men are crucial. I mean, they're the ones who are voting. They're the ones who are largely holding office. They were not just allies in this movement, they were also leaders in this movement.
Thank you. Catherine May has a question. Did the Black suffragists also prioritize the vote for men?
That's a good question too. So I would say that they had a lot more issues that were kind of more equal in importance than the suffragists who, as I said, these organizations like the National American Women's Suffrage Association, they were just solely focused on women's voting rights and, often implicitly just focused on white women's voting rights. So Black suffragists like Mary Church Terrell, the National Association of Colored Women, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, often kind of grouped voting rights more broadly than white suffragists did. So they were certainly kind of promoting votes for Black men, but I think it's fair to say that they were doing it at the same level because they saw them as connected to women's voting rights too. Right. And that's because, in the 1890s, when states are passing laws about poll taxes and literacy tests and grandfather clauses, those same laws apply to Black men that apply to Black women. So in some ways, the things that are preventing Black men from voting are exactly the same as the laws that are preventing Black women from voting, particularly after 1920. So they're in some ways their efforts to win the vote are very much tied together.
Thank you. Mary Melcher has a question. Was the image of the Black woman fighting Jim Crow in the crisis one of the few positive images of Black women related to suffrage?
That's a really smart question. And the answer is yes. I mean, quite frankly, one of the reasons why I like to show that image is because it's so unusual and unique in the many, many, many images that I worked on and worked with for this project. This is white women's organizations, suffrage organizations didn't represent Black women. And unfortunately, as much as Mary Church Terrell tried, her organization, the National Association of Colored Women, never had the resources, never had the funding, never had the expertise to kind of launch the same kind of very expensive kind of campaign, right? So they didn't produce the kind of the amount of propaganda that white women's organizations did. So yeah, this is really one of the very few images about how a Black women need the vote in order to protect their children and why they should have the ballot that we can find from this period. So that's a really important point.
Thank you. Catherine May has another question. Was the Jane Addams of the NAACP the same Jane Addams at Hull House?
You bet. Jane Addams is everywhere and doing everything. And as you may know, she's a very famous peace advocate. She ultimately becomes the first American woman to win the Nobel Peace Prize. Jane Addams is, an extraordinary woman.
We have another question from Mary Rothschild. I wonder if you have ever looked at other publicity avenues suffragists used in their fight for suffrage. I have a cookbook that was a fundraiser in 1909 for the Washington State suffrage ballot, which finally passed in 1910, signed by a Maine organizer to a woman doctor in Seattle. The cover has two banners, Votes for Women and Good Things to Eat, with another headline that said, Washington Women's Cookbook. I found it in a closet in an apartment in Seattle when I was a grad student. It remains a treasured object.
That's amazing. Yeah, I've looked at these cookbooks. I, in fact, have a reproduction of one. The National Park Service has been selling one for the centennial that I could not resist purchasing. And I've made a recipe out of it. I've made the strawberry shortcake. It turned out fantastic. I think that these are really valuable. And I think that actually they're very much related to the idea of suffragists being good mothers, good wives, good domestic caregivers, right? So if we emphasize that suffragists are good cooks, like they do in these cookbooks, then that very much connects with some of the imagery that we also see them producing in that time period.
Mary Rothschild has another comment. Jane Addams also kept the Chicago schools from being segregated when she formed an alliance with Ida B. Wells. Together, they went to the school board to make their argument. So,
yeah, Jane Addams was one of the founding members of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. I mean, yeah, this doesn't surprise me at all.
thank you. Does anyone else have any questions or comments that they would like to add? We'll just let them think about that. For those of you that are listening, was there anything surprising that you learned from Allison's presentation that you really didn't know about? You have a request here from Katie Solon. May we invite you, Dr. Lang, to speak to Democrats Abroad excuse me, I just lost that. Oh, hang on. I'm losing my chat. Here we go. Sorry. All right, I'm going to read this again. May we invite you to speak to Democrats Abroad Global Women's Caucus, 10,000 members around the world.
Sure, I'm always happy to talk about history of women's suffrage, as you can guess.
All right, I did see we have a big thank yous and excellent presentation from listeners. And let's see. Lori Boone said the reason the women wore white. I'm not sure what.
I think that's a reference to why women wore white for the photographs.
So thank you so much for joining us and participating. We really appreciate it. I learned a lot. Oh,
thank you. It was wonderful to chat with all of you, and thank you for organizing this really excellent conversation with great questions too.
Good. Thank you. So I thought for just a couple of minutes, I'd talk a little bit about the Arizona Women's History Alliance. In 2012, several historians and I were talking about how there is a lot written about Arizona women, but most people aren't aware of all of the wonderful things that they have done. So we formed the Arizona Women's History Alliance, which is a 501c3, and our focus has been to put on these symposiums. Usually we have a theme every year, and the other was to really encourage people to write good history about the women of Arizona. And so that is why we put on, as I said, that's why we put on the symposium. I sometimes get emails from people asking me how they can join the Arizona Women's History Alliance because they think it sounds really interesting. And our board has decided that if you are interested in joining the Arizona Women's History Alliance, we will be happy to list you as a member. We do not have at this point any fees or anything that you have to do, but I guess the comments that I've received is I would like to belong to the Women's History Alliance because I think it's important that we publicize the wonderful things that Arizona women have done. I retired as the state archivist and director of the Arizona State Archives and Records Management branch of the Arizona State Library Archives and Public Records a few years ago. I received my PhD from Arizona State University. I served as the chair of the Arizona Women's Hall of Fame for 12 years, president of the Southwest Oral History Association, president of the Conference of Intermountain Archivists, president of the Coordinating Committee for History in Arizona, as a board member of the Council of State Archivists and the board of the National Association of Government Archivists and Records Administrators. As I said, I am a co-founder of the Arizona Women's History Alliance. I have conducted over 100 oral history interviews, ranging from legislative histories to interviews with the original residents of the first Sun City. My research interests include retirement communities and women in the 19th and 20th century West. So, what I really hope that you gain from this presentation is an understanding of the complex history of women's suffrage in Arizona, the importance of grassroots movements and the contributions of individuals to those movements, change points where your organization or your grassroots movement was moving in one direction and then something happens and it changes completely in another direction. To understand the significance of past events and their relationships to the present, the benefits of cooperation and compromise as ways to solve problems, how political motivations impact people and events, that the ways in which obtaining the right to vote intersected and collided with the provision of other rights, especially for women of color and Indigenous communities. And just to remind you, as Allison mentioned, one of the reasons the struggle both nationally and in the territories took so long was that women could not vote, and therefore there were no political consequences for legislators ignoring them. I wanted to provide just context for Arizona's suffrage movement, because as we all know, nothing happens in a vacuum. And Allison and Katie did go over this as well, but nothing like repetition to help us remember. In 1869, the National Women's Suffrage Association organized, and their focus was to get an amendment to the US Constitution. As Allison said, they did not support the 15th Amendment unless it included women. They just felt, wasn't that they necessarily felt that Black men shouldn't get the vote, but they were just feeling like if we're going to have an amendment like this, let's put women in there. And the founders of this movement were Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott. A few months after the National Women's Suffrage Association organized, the American Women's Suffrage Association organized, and their focus was on changes to state and territorial constitutions. They felt very strongly that they were going to have a difficult time with Congress, as they certainly did, and that if they could get more states and territories to put this in their constitution, they would be able to bring pressure on Congress to have a national amendment. And the founders for this organization were Lucy Stone, Julia Ward Howe, Mary Livermore, Henry Ward Beecher. And as I said, they supported the 15th Amendment, which was one of the reasons why these two organizations were formed, because they had different objectives. The Women's Christian Temperance Union was founded in 1874, and they advocated the prohibition of alcoholic drinks because of the immense numbers of alcoholics in the country, the majority of the men, and the impact that alcoholism had on families. In 1876, Frances Willard became president of this group, and she felt that while their main goal was the prohibition of alcoholic drinks, that it was very important for them to advocate for other reforms, one of which was women's suffrage. And as Allison mentioned, they had a they had a lot of women who belonged to this organization. In 1890, the National Women's Suffrage Association and the American Women's Suffrage Association joined together and created the National American Woman Suffrage Association. Their focus was turned to trying to get states and territories again to put suffrage into their constitutions. And the reason that they did that was because they were having such a difficult time getting Congress to do anything about the amendment. We've talked about this at other speakers this morning. Although their role is often not recognized, African American women played an important role in the passage of the 19th Amendment. Because of their unique position, Black women tended to focus on human rights and universal suffrage rather than suffrage solely for African Americans or for women. And African American women that you're familiar with led these: Harriet Tubman, Sojourner Truth, Mary Church Terrell, and Ida B. Wells. African American women were in general excluded from attending the National American Women's Suffrage Association conventions and marches. So they organized their own groups. They attended political conventions at their local churches where they planned strategies to gain the right to vote. And in 1913, Ida B. Wells founded the Alpha Suffrage Club of Chicago, which was the nation's first Black women's club focused specifically on suffrage. In 1911, as more and more states, especially in the West, were adding women's suffrage to their constitutions, an organization was formed called the National Association Opposed to Women's Suffrage. And I've always liked this image because they're all men standing there looking at what they're arguing for, and the woman on the right-hand side sort of looks like she's curious as to what's going on. That basically shows you suffrage by state. And I think it's important to look at this because you can see that the states that are in blue had full voting rights before the 19th Amendment. And you'll notice that most of them are in the West or in the central United States. Those in gray had full voting rights before the 19th Amendment and before they became states. You will, of course, notice that Arizona was one of those that had full voting rights before the 19th Amendment. The states in green are those who could vote for president before the 19th Amendment. They usually were not allowed to vote for their own legislators or for Congress, but their states allowed them to vote for president. And everything in yellow gained voting rights with the passage of the 19th Amendment. And you'll notice how many of those states are in the South. So I'll just go over what Katie said this morning. In 1869, Wyoming was admitted as a territory and women were granted suffrage, first territory to do that. In 1893, Colorado granted women suffrage. In 1896, Utah and Idaho were admitted as states, and both of them granted women suffrage. In 1910, Washington granted women suffrage. In 1911, California granted suffrage. And in 1912, Oregon and Arizona also granted women suffrage. These are some of the, I don't want to use the word propaganda, but some of the examples of what the national organization that was against women's suffrage. And you can see from these images, or this image, that these are in some ways quite like the images that Allison showed us. It's amazing how many of the images, these are like little postcards they send out, have a father with squalling twins in his lap. So this one says, votes for women, it's election day, dad can't go out because why? He has to stay home and take care of the children and the house. This is another one, a suffragette's home, votes for women, dad comes home, the children are sobbing, everything's a mess, the wife isn't there. Why? Because she got the vote. Another one, I want to vote, but don't let me. A woman's place is in their home, giving that message to children. Again, you can see that baby's on the ground and that she's being ordered to go back to the home. This is one of my favorites, the origin and development of a suffragette. Little pet at 15, little coquette at 20. Oh, by age 40, she's not married. And at age 50, she is a violent radical suffragette. So this is also something that was put out by the national organization opposed to women's suffrage. Household hints, and on the back, vote no for women's suffrage. And so what were their arguments? Well, they argued that women are different. Their place is in the home, and giving the women the vote would expose them to corrupt politics. Giving them the vote will destroy the home and families. Women didn't want the vote, and only a few, mostly radical women, would use it. Women are not capable of understanding the issues. Women will vote the way their husbands do, so why waste time and money giving them the vote? They also capitalized on the fact that not all women wanted the vote. And so these were basically the arguments that they were providing to people. What were the suffrage arguments? Well, they changed over time. At first, just asking for equal rights in a lot of other things besides voting, and then really focusing on the voting. And so their arguments were things like, women don't get the vote, they are being taxed without representation. Those who obey the laws should have a choice in choosing those who make the laws. Laws affecting women are passed without consulting them. Women are wage workers and should have a say in legislation regarding wages and working conditions. Women can clean up government. Moral education and educational and humane legislation will be more easily passed if women have the vote. Objections to women having the vote are based on prejudice and not on reason. And it would increase the numbers of native-born voters. That was important to them. I like this cartoon. Obviously for suffrage, but this is the anti-suffrage quartet. And you'll notice there are 3 men in there, and they're all singing, and 1 woman, and they're all singing the same song. Women do not want the vote. And it says the repertoire of this admirable combination includes all the familiar, sophisticated melodies. Protect the home, sweet woman, sphere in the home, keep your dear mother out of politics. Oh, leave things as they be. Let women mind the baby. Let them use their influence, etc., etc., etc. Here's another political cartoon. That I think says everything. Woman has no voice because she's voteless. They are unequal under the law, so inequality under the law. They have no financial control. There are artificial limitations on what they can do. There is prejudice against women, and that much of this prejudice is just custom and can be changed. So basically, those are the arguments from both sides. Arizona's suffrage movement basically starts in 1883 when Murat Masterson introduced a women's suffrage bill into the legislature. And you can see that the newspapers were not kind to him. They first didn't mention his name at all in the newspaper. And if you look at what's written as red, Judas Iscariot, when he realized he had sold his savior for 30 pieces of silver, went out and hanged himself. And what should the man do who has thus given himself dead away on so serious a proposition? In other words, this man was a Judas Iscariot to the other men who didn't want women's suffrage. And 1 month later, Masterson's women's suffrage bill is now buried in the wastebasket beyond resurrection, and man yet wears the breeches. That was our first our first foray into official suffrage. It's important to know that the Women's Christian Temperance Union was first organized in Arizona in 1884. Their membership grew quickly. It was established first in Prescott. And so it's not hard to imagine that these women who maybe hadn't officially joined were, at that time, were persuading Mr. Masterson to introduce that first bill. In 1885, there was a second bill introduced, and that bill was also defeated. And again, this is just a little blurb from the newspaper, but it was treated with a great deal of scoffing, and General Wardell was talked about as just flirting with all these women that were up in the balconies looking on in favor of women's suffrage. And you'll note it says, even the bearing of arms, serving on juries, and wearing rubber boots, if women get the vote. It is said that the favor of this measure, that public morals, patriotism, and probity will be assured. And that same day, that there was a lot of levity and humor over him introducing that bill. However, one of the things that the newspaper said was, maybe we'd better take this a little more seriously, because in the state of Washington, their legislature did not take it very seriously, and they ended up getting the vote. So Arizona suffrage begins in Arizona with official organizations with the efforts of Josephine Brawley Hughes. She was a teacher and the co-owner with her husband of the Arizona Daily Star, a Tucson newspaper. In 1890, she was the president of the state Women's Christian Temperance Union, and she resigned from that position because she wanted to focus on women's suffrage. She used the newspaper as a forum to discuss suffrage. It was easy to put that in the newspaper and have people read it. In 1891, she organized the first suffrage organization in Arizona, and not surprisingly, many Women's Christian Temperance Union members joined the suffrage organization. And here's where we first see the intersection with the national organization. Josephine reached out to the national organization, and they sent Laura M. Johns, a field worker, to help her establish suffrage clubs in every Arizona county. One of the weaknesses in Josephine Brawley Hughes' approach to this was that she had an intense dislike for the Mormons and had led a campaign against them through her husband's newspaper because of polygamy. She refused to work with them, even though they strongly supported women's suffrage. However, they were still able to go out and organize these clubs. And if you think about Arizona in 1890, the fact that they went out and organized these clubs says a great deal for them, because roads were really poor. Railroads were not particularly great. So they're going out to visit people in wagons and coaches and through the heat and all of those sorts of things, but they did organize the groups. Together with Laura M. Johns, Josephine Brawley Hughes addressed the Arizona Constitutional Convention of 1891. Unfortunately, suffrage was defeated 16 votes to 5. In 1896, Laura M. Johns came back to Arizona again to help strengthen the suffrage clubs that had been created. The clubs at that time did not include Mormons or Mexican Americans. They did not reach out to them. In 1896, Hughes spoke at the National Annual Convention in Philadelphia. And you can see the efforts that she made, because in 1893, 1895, and 1897, she was able to persuade at least one legislator to present suffrage bills in the territorial legislature. All of them were defeated. And her approach was very typical of women of her age, in that She really used the polite approach. She went to the legislators. She asked them to put this bill in. She talked to legislators, but did not believe in lobbying. So there wasn't a lot that happened after the bill was introduced. Between 1899, pardon me, and 1909, there was a real shift in the direction that it took. Carrie Chapman Catt, who at that time was the head of the national organization, came to Arizona. She was looking for younger, more assertive leadership in the territory. She convinced Pauline O'Neill and Frances Munns and several other women who had been supporters of suffrage to organize the Arizona Territorial Women's Suffrage Association. And again, they traveled throughout the territory, organizing suffrage clubs in 12 of Arizona's 14 counties, and spoke at meetings and outdoor rallies. Under their leadership, the suffragists began an aggressive campaign to give women the right to vote. In 1899, after Josephine Brawley Hughes had resigned as president of the suffrage organization, Pauline O'Neill, Frances Munns, and Hattie Talbot worked with labor leader T.J. Morrison to force suffrage legislation to a vote to make sure that no bills in the House could move forward until legislators voted on the suffrage bill. He did his job. It passed the House and was filibustered in the Senate, and the bill failed. But Pauline O'Neill organized and held the very first suffrage convention. This was really important because this meant that women from all over the territory came to Phoenix and they were able to sit down and strategize together. I just want to give you a little sense of what it was like when in 1899, when that bill was under consideration. I'm just going to give you two examples here. This is a suffrage telegram to George W.P. Hunt, who was a member of the legislature from Gila County. It was written February 19th, 1899. 36 people signed it, and the text reads, "As citizens and taxpayers of Globe and Gila County, believing that bill now before council granting suffrage to women in Arizona is inimical to the best interests of the territory, we request and urge you to oppose and vote against the women's suffrage bill." February 27th, 1899, this was a telegram to Hunt signed by 3 men and 6 women, and it says, "We learned only 2 days ago that a telegram misrepresenting the wishes of the people here had been forwarded to you remonstrating against the passage of the women's suffrage bill. We, the undersigned, have a petition signed by at least 3/4 of the taxpayers of this city, which will be forwarded by mail. We ask you to use your judgment, as we have implicit confidence in your honor and your integrity." There are many more documents flowing back and forth between Hunt and people pro and against suffrage. So it's really interesting to look at, because you can see that the state is gearing up, and there are more people that are men and women that are supporting suffrage and more organized against suffrage. In 1901, they held a second territorial suffrage convention. And one of the members of the group that was president, Lita Robinson, started writing a suffrage newsletter that went out to all the supporters around the state. And she sent this out just about every month and very faithfully kept that image of women's suffrage, pro-suffrage in people's minds. And in 1903, they held a third territorial suffrage convention, and Lita Robinson was elected president. This was, again, important because these women, they're learning more and more and more about strategy and more about how to work together. And so they are coming up with strategies that they can all use. That year, Robinson, O'Neill, and Munns lobbied legislators for a suffrage bill. And interestingly, it passed the House and Council. You can only imagine how thrilled that these women were that it had passed both houses. This is an image of the original act, which you cannot read, so I will read it for you. Every woman above the age of 21 years residing in this territory and otherwise possessing the qualifications of an elector shall have the right to vote, and therefore there shall be no distinction between the sexes as to the qualifications of voters. You can imagine their disappointment when Governor Alexander Brody, who had been sort of sitting on the fence, but giving the impression that he was going to support this bill, vetoed it. And he sent a long document to the House explaining why. You can see this note in the original Journal of the House in Arizona in red. It says vetoed March 19th, 1903. He said it was illegal for them because of the Enabling Act that made Arizona a territory. So Arizona had no legal right to change their constitution and to ask for this, even though 4 other states had already included women's suffrage in their constitutions. So Arizona's suffragists became extremely disheartened, and although they may have worked behind the scenes, there were no suffrage bills introduced in the legislature, for several years. There was another change in leadership and tactics and focus in 1909. That year, Anna Howard Shaw, who was the head of the national organization, sent field worker Laura Clay to Arizona to work with Frances Willard Munns to revive Arizona's efforts for suffrage. They reorganized, and Frances became president of the new Arizona Equal Suffrage Association. She really did change direction. She decided we need to appeal to male voters, not legislators, because legislators are just not going to support us. She also recognized that Mormons could be a very powerful ally. She was a consummate strategist, and under her leadership, Arizona suffragists created a powerful coalition supporting women's suffrage made up of miners, labor leaders, farmers, ranchers, Mormons, Democrats, and Republicans. She didn't care what party they belonged to. Suffragists met with prominent Mexican-American business and political leaders, but they did little outreach to Mexican workers. And Arizona's suffragist actions reflected a really common Western prejudice against the average Mexican worker, in that they believed that they were illiterate and that they did not understand the issues around suffrage, and that they would vote against it. In 1909, Laura Clay, that's a representative from the national organization, persuaded Munns and a number of other organizations to support legislation requiring an English literacy test to vote. This was aimed at Mexicans and Mexican Americans, and it was very successful. And I wanted to give you an idea of what Arizona's population was in 1910. We only had 204,354 people, not very big. We did have 2,009 African Americans, and you can see they made up 1% of Arizona's residents. These African Americans were primarily male. There were only a few women and children here at that time. But the suffrage movement did not reach out, as far as we can tell, to the African American males who were very active politically, at least certainly in Phoenix during that period. Chinese made up only 0.6 of the population, Japanese 0.2 of the population. The biggest group in Arizona's population outside of those from Europe or from the United States were Mexicans, 5,102, with 29,402 born outside the US. This was about 25% of Arizona's population, a significant voting bloc, but because of the legislation on reading literacy tests, it was difficult for them because they were given something to read that probably a lot of The Anglos would not have been able to read themselves. So the national organization in 1910 sends Laura Gregg to Arizona. She works very closely with the women's suffrage organization in Arizona and with Frances Munns. So she's trying to gain support for women's suffrage, and she traveled all through the state. In 1910, Munns decided she wanted to couple statehood with women's suffrage. So she and several other women presented their case to the Constitutional Convention. Arizona had to write a constitution if they wanted to become a state. It had to be approved by Congress, and then it could move forward as to them becoming a state. The delegates rejected suffrage plank 30-19. It's interesting to read the minutes of the Constitutional Convention because many of those arguments that we looked at earlier about why women shouldn't have the vote were actually spoken by several legislators against women's suffrage. Munns was really unhappy with George W.P. Hunt, who was president of the Constitutional Convention and had been a strong supporter of women's suffrage in the past, but did not support the inclusion of suffrage in the Constitution, which again had to be approved by Congress. Realistically, if you look at his decision, you can understand probably why they didn't put that in there, because they were trying to become a state, and had they put something in there about the women getting the right to vote in the new Constitution, it would have probably been rejected by Congress. When they sent the Constitution to Congress, they rejected two things in the Constitution: the recall of judges and initiative and referendum. They just said, if you want to become a state, you're going to have to take that out of there. So that's what they did. However, in 1912, the referendum, the initiative and referendum and recall of judges was put back into Arizona's constitution by the legislature. They introduced a referendum for women's suffrage to the new state legislature. It was introduced by Josephine Brawley Hughes' son, who was a representative from Tucson. And it was defeated by one vote. And in 1912, they added the literacy test again into the Constitution, which eliminated, or not the Constitution, pardon me, into law, which eliminated a very large percentage of Mexican voters. Munns used the initiative to collect petitions to put suffrage on the ballot for the 1912 elections. She decided, not only are we going to have this coalition, but we are going to put this on the ballot so that they have to vote for it or against it in the 1912 elections. Munns was not only a consummate strategist, but she was very gifted in speaking. She was able to use persuasion, very polite and intellectual persuasion. She, again, created coalitions around the state. She was a gracious and energetic woman. And even though there were many people against women's suffrage, they never talked about her as being the kind of in-your-face person that some of those anti-suffrage people were talking about. Saloon men were against suffrage because obviously a lot of the women who belonged to the suffrage movement were members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union. And Munns galvanized women around the state to speak, to persuade, and to get signatures. This is the ballot from Greenlee County. And if any of you have family members who have been in the state a long time, you might want to go to the state archives and look at these petitions to see if your grandfather or great-grandfather or great-great-grandfather signed this in support of this. They were able to collect the petitions. And if you can imagine, they were doing this in the hot summer months in Arizona. So think about the kind of clothing that women were wearing. long sleeves, even if they were short sleeved. There were corsets and there were the long dresses. It was very hot and uncomfortable. And yet these women were out there with their petitions, trying to persuade men to sign them. After the petition had been accepted, more signatures than they needed, Munns set up her headquarters in the newly rebuilt Adams Hotel. She wrote editorials, opinion pieces, and articles for the press. She was very gifted, as I said, as a speaker. She could organize a lot of things from her headquarters here. On the day of the election, the women who were in favor of suffrage, and even a number of men, handed out this handbill. This is an image of an original handbill that they handed out. Votes for women, don't fail to vote yes. And they gave their reasons for why they wanted the vote. And the first one is, those who obey the law should have a say in their making. Those who pay taxes to support government should be represented by the government. And those who have charge of the home and the children must be able to protect them. And then as a final note, remember this: Arizona women struggled as anxiously as men in building the state. They were able to persuade close to 68% of the male electorate to vote in favor of suffrage. This did not mean that all the women in Arizona got the vote. African Americans got the vote, Mexican Americans got the vote, Native American, male and female, did not get the vote, the opportunity to vote until the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. But there were so many loopholes in the act that it allowed states to sort of make their own rules. And so in Arizona, Native Americans did not get the vote until 1948. We were the second to the last state. Arizona, like many southern states, also instituted poll taxes, which really excluded the poor and many people of color. So what happened in Arizona? In 1913, in January, the state legislature passed an emergency law allowing Arizona women to vote, to register to vote. And in 1913, the Arizona Federation of Women's Clubs successfully lobbied for the legislature to pass legislation for an 8-hour workday for women, for mothers' pensions, and for raising the age of sexual consent for females from 14 to 16, and for males to age 18. Women voted. They understood how important it was, since they had fought so hard for this, for them to register to vote and to go out and vote on issues. In 1914, Frances Munns was voted the Arizona's first female senator. And in that same year, Rachel Berry, who was a suffrage supporter from Apache County, became the first female representative in the Arizona legislature. The Arizona Women's Christian Temperance Union worked very hard to register female votes. The WCTU and other organizations got sufficient signatures to place a prohibition initiative on the ballot, just as the liquor men or the saloon men had dreaded. It won with 53% of the state's voters supporting it. And in 1915, Arizona became a tri-state. In August of 1915, Asian American women in Phoenix organized the Arizona Federation of Colored Women's Clubs to educate voters on issues and candidates, to fight racism, and to improve economic and educational opportunities in their communities. The Colored Women's Club members went before the Phoenix City Council to protest the showing of the birth of a nation. That took a lot of courage. Rosa Lyons McKay, legislator from Cochise County, introduced and got passed the first minimum wage bill for women. In the 3 legislative sessions, she was able to raise the minimum wage for women from around $3 a week to $16. Women were simply not paid at that time anything close to what men were paid. So the average man may have been earning $16 a week, but women, as I said, were earning $3. This was a tremendous help for women in Arizona. In 1920, 4 female legislators introduced Arizona's ratification of the 19th Amendment, and it passed unanimously in both houses. The interesting thing about this is that Governor Campbell sent out a call to the legislature to tell them that they needed to vote on this. And one of the things that he said was, Arizona women have proved that they are intelligent, that they are good legislators, and they no longer had any worries about them not knowing what they were doing. It passed unanimously in both houses. So Arizona then ratified the 19th Amendment for us. In 1922, as a result of female legislators and the pressure that women voters were able to put on legislators who were in office, Arizona passed the Shepherd-Towner Act for mothers and well babies. This was a federal act for which the states could get funding to make sure that mothers were healthy and that babies were healthy as well. As I said, Arizona Native Americans did not get the vote until 1948, and this is a result. Frank Harrison and Henry Austin, World War II veterans and members of the Yavapai tribe at Fort McDowell, sued the Maricopa County recorder for refusing to allow them to register to vote. Judge Levi S. Udall, who ruled in their favor, wrote, quote, "To deny the right to vote where one is legally entitled to do so is to do violence to the principles of freedom and equality." In Arizona, women have remained active in the legislature and in other elected offices. We have some of the highest numbers of women that have served in the legislature or been elected to governor and to state-held offices than in most states. So August 18th, 1920, Tennessee became the 36th state to ratify the amendment. This is Alice Paul with her flag. She would sew a star on the flag for every state that ratified, and there was a lot of celebration going on because of this. At long last, women got the vote. So celebrations all over the country, and all US women could now cast votes, or could they? Federal laws, as Allison said, prohibited groups from becoming citizens. You have to be a citizen to vote. If you're an excluded group under federal statute, you are prohibited from becoming a citizen. And as we look back in our history, our country's history, the 1882 Chinese Exclusion Act was one of the first acts that our Congress passed, saying these people are not citizens. And again, the Indian Citizenship Act of 1924. Until then, no Native Americans could vote. In 1933, because of World War II and the need to get China on the side of the Allies, federal government passed the Magnuson Act, which for the first time allowed them to vote. In 1946, the Luce-Celler Act allowed Filipinos and residents from India to vote as they became citizens and could vote. And it wasn't until 1952 with the Immigration Act that the Japanese and other Asian Americans were able to vote. So I hope that even though this has been a very rapid discussion of Arizona women's suffrage, that you have a little better understanding of the complex history of women's. Grassroots movements have power, and I think that's an important thing for us to remember. Looking back at all of the work that the suffragists did in Arizona and in the nation, we can learn a great deal from them about the importance of grassroots movements. And even in a grassroots movement, an individual can make a difference. Look at the way that Arizona changed its direction in 1899 and again in 1909, when they started reaching out to male voters, understanding that this was going to be what helped them. Every movement has its ups and downs, its detours and its brick walls, and they make mistakes. You can see those mistakes when you go back and look at our history, when you see that there were certain groups that the legislature basically marginalized, so they couldn't vote. The power of coalitions and building coalitions is really important. That's what grassroots are so good at. It's a lesson we can learn. Persistence is really important. It was 72 years that the national organization fought for women's suffrage. And in Arizona, it was 29 years, but those were 29 hard years, putting a lot of devotion and dedication toward this. And I would like to say that Frances Willard Munn would never agree with anyone who said their efforts and their vote did not count. She believed that with her whole heart. Economics and political motivations can really impact people and events. And especially, I think, those people who are in power and who make the laws, they can put a lot of detours and brick walls in the ways of those who are fighting for something. It is important that we look at the significance of past events and their relationships to the present. We can see their mistakes, we can see their victories, we can see the things that they struggled with, and hopefully we can learn from these things so that we are not dividing ourselves when we're trying to fight for the same thing. I think this year of celebration is a wonderful time to celebrate the strength of these early women and to continue the legacy that they gave us when they were doing all of this work. And as an archivist and as a former archivist and historian, I would really urge women's organizations to make sure that their records are deposited in an archives where future researchers and historians will have access to these papers. There are not enough of these kinds of collections in archives, and they can be, even if there are things in the history that perhaps make that organization look racist, history is messy, and it's the way it is, but we can learn from those things, and they really do show us the directions that people were going in. It's important, as I said, to understand Arizona's intersections with national women's suffrage organizations. Arizona could not have done this on their own. They received so much help from women like Laura Gregg and Laura Johns, and even Laura Clay, in spite of the fact that she asked them to pass legislation that was going to prohibit a number of Mexican Americans and others from voting. And the consequences of marginalization, I think it's important for us to understand this as well. Native Americans still have problems in Arizona voting in elections. And I think it's important for us to just be aware of those things and not to close our eyes to them. The Arizona Women's it has a fundraiser to have a statue of Frances Willard Munns. And the sculptor that we chose after a national search is a young sculptor from Surprise, Arizona. And she explained this is the maquette that she did for the judging. And she explained that the flag that Frances Willard Munns is carrying represents all of the work that the women who came before her did nationally and in the state of Arizona. She doesn't have anything in her hand, but the hand that is outstretched is going to have that handbill that the women handed out on election day, November 5th, 1912. And that is a 1912 voter's box. She wanted to show Frances Munns marching into the future because she said she didn't want anyone that looked at this to think, oh, they got the vote and then they stopped. So this is what it looks like. We have been very excited because we have to work with the Arizona Department of Administration to get this there. And the gentleman that we're working with loves this project. He said he was the envy of many of the people in his department because we got to do this. And so they gave us a really wonderful site. Frances Munns will be one of the first statues that you see if you come into the park from the legislature. She's facing the legislature, which I think is really appropriate, with that bill in her hand. And there she is. I just wanted to show you how far the sculptor has come in her statue building. We are very excited about this. She's going to be representing at Arizona Women. Suffered in Arizona 2021. Sorry about the incomplete note above. I'm searching for info on current legislative activity in Arizona. Unfortunately, I'm not familiar with the political positions of the various sites. So out of respect for each of you, I don't want to share my findings. My search term Google was Arizona 2021 voting bills, lots of information. Shirley Mooney said, if you go to www.azleg.gov and click on the legislative information tab, then the full text search in the drop-down menu, you can enter the terms voting and elections and get a large list of bills. You can get full text copies of the bills, which are listed by number, not by title. So you have to click on each item to see contents. We're told Mary Melchers of Axing, were poll taxes collected in every county? As far as I know, the answer to that is yes. They were collected in all counties. Some counties got rid of them sooner than others, but yes, I don't know what people had to pay. I would have to go back and look at city council minutes or county minutes, board of supervisors minutes to know what they had to pay, but it was significant enough that it made it difficult for others. I think the literacy tests were difficult. I know when I was doing some research on that, part of what they required was they would just hand someone that was trying to pass the literacy test a copy of the United States Constitution and ask them to start reading. The literacy rates among whites in Arizona sometimes weren't all that high either, but they didn't have to take the literacy test. That was reserved for African Americans and Mexicans. And
my question / statement was, it was my understanding that native-born Asian Americans, like the Chinese and Japanese, were allowed to vote. And that really, of those exclusions laws were throughout the West. My understanding is that the exclusion acts were from immigrants becoming citizens, but that native-born children are eligible for voting when they came of age because of the 14th Amendment. Of course, that was not true for Native Americans because of treaty issues until those acts changed. Am I wrong in my understanding?
it depended on the race. If you start looking up those bills, you can see that for some, their children were allowed to vote, and part of this was because sometimes when they wrote the act, they would allow those people to vote, and then the government decided, oops, nope, we don't want these people to be citizens again. So yes, and they could vote sometimes in local elections, but for Congress and those kinds of elections, it was much more difficult. That's my understanding.
Because I know in Arizona, for instance, that the Japanese had a lot of the flower gardens, for instance, on Baseline Road in Phoenix. Yes. And they couldn't buy land if they were immigrants. So all of their land was bought and in the name of the children. Once you had an infant, they could buy land. And so you had, 2-year-olds owning 100 acres on Baseline Road because that was how their parents could have land. But I also know that until the Married Women's Independent Citizenship Act in 1924, native-born American women, if they married a Japanese man, immigrant, they lost their citizenship. And the Japanese wouldn't give them Japanese citizenship, so they were stateless, actually.
Yes, that's right.
But my understanding was that native-born children were, regardless of race, except for Native Americans, and that's because of treaty issues, were citizens under the 14th Amendment.
I will go back and look at my research again. Thank you.
Katie Solon asks also, did poll taxes and literacy tests disproportionately affect Native Americans and people of color? And when were these discontinued? And of course they did, but go ahead and answer, Melanie.
Yes, they did. I am not sure exactly in Arizona when they ended. As you know, Arizona was, in the Voting Act, they were not so great in making it easy for people to vote, and so we were constantly having to send things into the federal government. So probably didn't answer your question. That's a really interesting question, and I am going to go and do some research on that. Really, when did they end in Arizona? So thank you.
Okay, well, in a general sense, but not particular to Arizona, all of those were ended with the Civil Rights Act of 1965, when Lyndon Johnson announced that when he signed it, that would lose the Democratic Party of the South forever. But I think it had ended considerably before then in Arizona, but I don't know the exact.
It had ended before that in Arizona, but Arizona still made it difficult for people sometimes to vote. So someone has asked, what about those of us who aren't on Facebook? You can go to our webpage, Arizona Women's History Alliance.org, and as soon as they're up, we'll put an announcement there as well.
And since I'm unmuted, I'd like to say one quick thing about the use of the word suffragette.
Yes, thank you.
Suffragette in America, in England, the Pankhurst, suffragette was a positive term used by suffrage workers. In America, it was an insult used by the anti-suffrage movement. And Arizona and American women who worked for suffrage were suffragists.
Yes.
I-S-T.
Yes.
Not suffragettes. And a lot of people now just assume suffragette was a positive word for suffrage supporters, but it was not. It was seen as an insult. And it's a thing with me. I want people to understand the difference between the two phrases.
It's a thing with me as well. And if you recall that one postcard that we had up there with the basically the evolution of a suffragette, that was an American that was put out by that anti-suffrage league. Right. Just showing that, yes, suffragettes are just vile, crazy, radical women. So,
well, state legislators last year wore white in Arizona to the opening day of the legislature when the ERA was coming up, and they called themselves they said they were wearing suffragette white, and I had to write to to one of my legislators who I love and say, please don't use that word, it's suffragist. And so she changed it all, and they all decided to change it, but it's just a thing.
Yeah, it is. Yes, thank you. Mary Melcher retired from her position as Education Program Manager for the Charlotte Hall Museum in Prescott. She completed her PhD in American History at Arizona State University with concentrations in 20th century women's history and the West. For the past 20 years, she has worked as a curator and consultant on numerous public history projects. She's conducted more than 150 oral histories, which have been featured in her publications, exhibits, radio programs, and videos. She was the lead historian for the Arizona Women's Heritage Trail, a public history project combining women's history with the interpretation of historic sites. This statewide project developed driving and walking tours, a traveling exhibit, a play related to women's suffrage in Arizona, and a web exhibit. Her publications on Arizona history focus on ranch and farm women, public health, and the impact of World War II. She authored the award-winning Pregnancy, Motherhood, and Choice in 20th Century Arizona with the University of Arizona Press. Thank you, Mary.
Okay, the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites is the founder of the National Votes for Women's Trail. It has two parts. One is a database and a digital trail, and you can see the website for the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites on the screen. You can go to that website in order to see the 2,100 sites related to women's suffrage that are on this digital trail. People from all over the country have researched and put suffrage sites on the digital trail. There's also a suffrage marker program, historical markers, funded by the Pomeroy Foundation and the Women's Suffrage Centennial Commission. And there will be 260 suffrage markers around the country, marking sites where women's activities occurred related to suffrage. Both the database and the digital map, as well as the suffrage markers, tell the story of suffrage for all women of all ethnicities, classes, and geographic areas from the colonial period to the present. There's been a big effort to make sure that these markers and the digital map and sites on the digital map reflect the ethnic, racial, and religious diversity in the country. Approximately 1/3 of the suffrage markers represent a diversity of perspective as defined by the National Votes for Women Trail Advisory Committee. About 20% represent people of color and mainly African-American suffragists. Many of these women were involved in the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs. They fought for suffrage as they worked for racial equality because they knew that the vote was vitally important to the African-American community, as we've discussed today. Another category in this diversity area is made up of working class women who participated in the movement. About 5% of the markers relate to the working class perspective. Here in Arizona, there are two sites that fall into this diversity category. One is in Patagonia at the Patagonia Schoolhouse Museum, where Hispanic women began voting in 1915. And the other is in Bisbee, where Laura Gregg Cannon gave a speech in front of the post office, and a lot of working men and women attended that speech. So there are two markers in Arizona that fall into this diversity area. Each state has a coordinator, or each state is supposed to have a coordinator in order to find these sites. I've been the coordinator in Arizona. It's a volunteer position, and that probably explains why not every state has a coordinator. It's been an interesting project. The goal was to find suffrage sites that represented the geographic, ethnic, class, religious, and gender diversity of the movement in the state. All of the marker nominations had to be approved by the National Votes for Women Trail Scholarly Advisory Committee and by the Pomeroy Foundation. I've been serving as the state coordinator, and I've also been on the advisory committee. And it's been really interesting to see the nominations from around the country, and especially to see all the nominations for markers related to women of color. Professor Kathleen Cahill, who will speak to us tomorrow morning, has also been on this advisory committee looking at all the nominations. Okay, so I mentioned that 4 sites have been approved in Arizona. In order to get these sites approved, as a coordinator, I had to submit primary sources related to the suffrage activity that occurred at a certain site. And then that went before the advisory committee and then before the Pomeroy Foundation. And they've been very clear about the need for strong primary sources. One of the sites is in Bisbee, and this is the old Bisbee post office. The library is on the 2nd floor there. In the plaza in front of this building, Laura Gregg Cannon gave a speech in September of 1912. She had been traveling throughout Arizona to organize suffrage clubs and to speak in favor of women's suffrage. Here she spoke to a crowd of approximately 500 people, according to the newspaper article about it. Bisbee at this time was a mining town with a population of about 10,000. At this point in their campaign, they were appealing to a wide coalition of male voters. As Melanie mentioned, I mean, they wanted to reach out to miners, union men, Republicans, Democrats, Mormons, ranchers, everybody they could reach. The large turnout in Bisbee indicates that working men were interested in the women's suffrage campaign and that people were coming out to hear what they had to say. The marker is mounted on the old Bisbee post office building. I had to find a sponsor for markers too for every community. Here the sponsors were the Bisbee Mining and Mineral Museum and the Bisbee Public Library. And here's a picture of the marker. As you can see, there are very few words in these markers. The Pomeroy Foundation and the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites are collecting all of the primary sources and research information, and they're going to be making them available to people that might be interested. Another suffrage site in southern Arizona is at the Patagonia Museum, which was the Patagonia Schoolhouse. This was a polling location in 1915. The small community who voted at this schoolhouse was made up of approximately 900 people. The community was mixed ethnically, about half were of Hispanic origin, and the primary industries were mining and ranching. Voting records indicate that Mexican American women voted at this polling location. As Melanie mentioned earlier, according to state law, new voters had to be able to read the US Constitution in English in order to register to vote. So this was designed to stop some people from voting, but by looking at the voter registration rolls and then also census records to determine for sure that these women were of Hispanic origin, I was able to prove that they did register there and they most likely voted. And the women that were on the census rolls, in the census as identified Hispanic and on the voting rolls were Mary Kane, Amalia Valenzuela, and Luisa Costello. Kane and Costello were both born in Mexico and they were married mothers. Amalia Valenzuela was a young woman from a large family who was born in the US, but her father was of Mexican descent. She was just 21 years old. So this site is significant because Latinas voted there shortly after women gained the right to vote in Arizona. This marker has been installed, and here's a photo of the great-great-great-granddaughter of Mary Kane standing in front of the suffrage marker that's in front of the Patagonia Museum. So it was neat that they were able to find Mary Kane's great-great-great-granddaughter, whose name is Riley Hulse. It was difficult to find historic buildings where suffrage events occurred in urban areas because so many buildings have been taken down in the cities of Tucson and Phoenix. In Tempe, I was able to tie the activities of Sally Hayden to the Hayden House, which is still standing, and it's being restored now to look like the house was when the Hayden family lived in it. Sally Davis Hayden worked in the Arizona Territorial Suffrage Association in the mid-1890s. She was an early pioneer to Arizona. She worked in the family ranch and ferry business, and she became involved in the suffrage movement. She worked with Josephine Hughes, and you heard from Melanie about the difficulties they had with the legislature getting anything done. She was involved during that time period. She influenced her son, Carl Hayden, to be in favor of women's suffrage, and he was elected to serve as Arizona's first congressional representative in 1913. That year, Carl Hayden introduced a joint resolution proposing a constitutional amendment to give women the vote. By this time, his mother had died. The resolution that he proposed did not emerge from the Committee on the Judiciary. Carl Hayden was still in Congress when the 19th Amendment came before the body, and he voted in favor of women's suffrage. So the Hayden House has national significance because Sally Davis Hayden was a suffragist, and she influenced her son, Carl Hayden, to advocate for women's suffrage in the US Congress. The Hayden marker is being produced and has not been installed yet. The local sponsor of the marker is the Tempe Historic Preservation Office and the Tempe Women's Club. The Tempe Women's Club volunteered to donate money for a boulder to place the marker on. The Historic Preservation Office wanted us to put it on a boulder because another marker in the same locale is also on a boulder. So it was very nice that the Tempe Women's Club stepped forward and agreed to provide funds for that. There is one marker in Northern Arizona, and that will be, oh, wait, it's just been installed at the Coconino County Courthouse. In Flagstaff, the Coconino County Courthouse is significant because Anna Howard Shaw, who was the president of the National American Woman Suffrage Association, gave a speech at this site in October 1912 pushing for the suffrage initiative. Shaw traveled around Arizona at this time. She gave the same speech in Phoenix, Prescott, and Winslow. She called it, quote, a humorous discourse on women's suffrage, unquote. She spoke to a crowded house, and she claimed that the United States had never been a true republic because one half of the people were disenfranchised. Furthermore, she said, quote, there are some people who do not want to come down to the dirty pool of politics. They prefer to remain up there on a pedestal, along with male idiots and criminals. I prefer to be down among you people, unquote. So here she's making a jab at those who said that women were on a pedestal, but she's saying that the ones who are on the pedestal and who can vote are the male idiots and criminals. Well, women can't. So Shaw was the president of the largest suffrage organization in the US, and that makes this event significant. In addition, it demonstrates the importance that national leaders placed on winning suffrage in the West. The Western victories proved that the home would not be destroyed if women voted. In addition, these victories buoyed suffragists throughout the country and increased the potential of electing pro-suffrage congressional leaders who could push for a national amendment. Okay, this marker was just installed Wednesday, and they had a little Facebook Live dedication ceremony. Unfortunately, I couldn't attend, but it was interesting to me that the county recorder spoke at the dedication ceremony and tied women's suffrage to voting rights issues today. Okay, to conclude, oh, sorry, I didn't show you that one. The Coconino County Facilities Department sponsored this marker. Okay, to conclude, the National Votes for Women Trail is made up of a digital map that's online with the National Collaborative for Women's History Sites website. and also suffrage markers that pay tribute to suffragists in Arizona and some of the first female voters. They provide physical reminders of the suffrage movement and those who exercised the right of the franchise. As you travel around the state after COVID restrictions are lifted, look for these markers and celebrate the strong women who fought for a right to vote and some of the earliest female voters. Thank you.